Definitely. Hey, Karim here, founder of Nude Human Consulting. The Coffee with Karim podcast aims to provide Muslims and people of all backgrounds a space to share their life gifts, meet dynamic guests, and enhance the human experience one cup of coffee at a time. Sit back and sip. Welcome to another episode of Coffee with Karim. Today I have a very special guest, Scott Fischer. He's an old-time friend as well as a professional colleague. He was born and raised in North Carolina, moved to the San Francisco Bay Area in 2006 to pursue a degree in East-West psychology and a master's in somatic psychology. In the past, he has worked as an expressive therapist at the California Pacific Medical Center, a behavioral coach at St. Vincent's School for Boys, as well as a wilderness guide with the Stepping Stone Project. Scott, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me, Karim. It's my pleasure.
So, Scott, why don't you start us off first by telling us about your upbringing? Was your family religious? Was there a specific cultural lean that they had? How would you describe your family background and upbringing?
Absolutely. Well, I was born in Greensboro, North Carolina back in 1981, which, had, 100,000 people or something, kind of a typical American suburban town. And my parents are both Jewish, and they were, I think, partly drawn there because there's a substantial Jewish community there, even though it's in the American South. And so, we sort of treaded the line between what they call Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism, but I would just put us under the broad umbrella of American Judaism and say that, that was my family's religious faith, and that was, to an extent, certainly cultural title or label that was bestowed on me, and that I, dealt with and managed and related to in my own way and still do. And we weren't particularly religious, but we would have Shabbat dinner a couple times a month, and we'd go to services here and there. And, it's certainly our kind of North Star orientation. And I had a bar mitzvah too.
Nice. So how much of Judaism did you identify with as a religious worldview versus more of a cultural perspective or cultural robe, so to speak?
That's a great question, man. I really liked this notion of Judaism. I am no scholar in Judaism, Karim, but this notion of Ein Sof, I believe it's referred to, which is kind of like this idea of God is unknowable. And I really related to that. And even as a kid, I just strongly related to that notion that, God is in the wind and God is in nature and God is all around us. And I feel like Judaism, it's not like the focus of Judaism, but Judaism allows for that. Even in the Americanized version, I remember kind of sitting in temple and being bored and like reading the translation of the prayers. And I feel like this is in there, So that part I did relate to, but I've never really been kind of like a Ten Commandments kind of guy or much of a Torah scholar. And I got interested more culturally as an adult, kind of when I moved out to the Bay Area, and there were like, Berkeley hippie Jews. And I would say it's never been kind of like a focus of my spiritual religious orientation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting is that theologically, I would say Judaism has a similar perspective of the divine as Islam. This idea that the divine is incomprehensible. God through, nature and creation as kind of sign points or signatures of how the divine manifests. So there is that similarity because it's very, of course, strict as far as its monotheism and making sure you don't ascribe images or ideas, right? I mean, no, I don't think any Jewish person would say, yeah, God is a man in the sky or something like that.
Exactly. And I feel like as non-Christians, one benefit is that we at least partially escape the white man in the sky motif. Partially. We're still subject to it, but
Right, right. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about your specializations in therapy. So, some of the things that you do is you help clients with social anxiety, ADHD, important life transitions such as leaving for college or becoming more autonomous as an individual, etc. But maybe for the audience, they're not really clear on what is somatic psychology exactly. So what does the word somatic mean, and what is psychosomatic therapy even look like? Like, how does that work? Are you doing physical exercises and talk therapy? I mean, how does that actually look in a session?
Yeah, well, somatic psychotherapy is a really broad term that describes a lot of different modalities that different people use. And, every somatic psychotherapist is going to practice differently because that's just how it is. And I studied somatic psychotherapy, which, the word soma is body, as far as I understand. So we explore the relationship of the mind and body as kind of a groundwork or a foundation of getting to know ourselves. And, I work with teenage boys, and a lot of them don't really want to delve into, the feelings in their heart and what wants to come out. They don't even want to sit in an office. So yeah, we go out for a walk or a hike, and they start talking and they feel comfortable. And so that to me is somatic therapy, because we're moving to allow the work to come into the body. So we start to get out of our head. We start to see a different perspective on the stories that we carry around. And so, for me too, I certainly pay attention to my own body and what I notice come up during different sessions. And I think it's very telling into the clinical work and what might be going on for the client. And with teenagers too, I consider it in the family system. I note how I feel around the parents and how they interact with me. And I note how I feel in the household. And certainly I note how clients hold themselves and how they hold themselves in relation to other people and to family members. And I'm always tracking body when I work with people, my own and theirs.
So it almost sounds like part of psychosomatic therapy is bodily movement in order to open up the channels of mental, emotional blockage, so to speak, right? So it's like about getting everything to be more fluid and reintegrated. And you used a phrase, being stuck in your head. Can you tell us more about what that means? And is there a difference between mind and brain, for example? Because some might say, well, the brain is part of the body. So what do you mean by the connection of the mind with the body, so to speak?
Yeah, I just think of a recent client that I met for the first time, and this is common, and I see this in myself sometimes too, where we spin around, and we might rub our chin and rub our eyes and rub our hair, and we wonder about the past, and we wonder about the future, and we wonder what's wrong with me, and I don't sleep 8 hours a night, and I don't drink 8 cups of water a day, and I do this too much, and I do this too much. And, we get so strongly identified with this I, and, and it's important to dissect that narrative. And, I mind and brain. I mean, different people need different languages to understand. Part of our work as therapists is that we're artists, and we paint different pictures and different metaphors for people to try to understand at least how we see all this going down. Yeah, and brain and health and body, they're all really important, I like to think that is all intertwined with these stories that live in our minds and that are intertwined in our bodies too. And they aren't just ours. They're the stories of our ancestors and of our cultures and of our histories. And this is mysterious and deep, Yeah.
No, thanks for explaining that. It makes a lot of sense. So I heard you say that it's about helping people recognize that this inner narrative or this constant cognitive script that goes on and runs and plays is not the only thing that defines us. I mean, I always tell people your mind is an instrument. It's not your total identity. Would you say that's accurate?
Totally. I mean, it's embedded in the language too. It's like this, someone comes to me and says, well, I have ADHD. I have ADHD and I'm 16 and I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 10 and I've been taking Ritalin ever since and I have ADHD and don't tell me that I have ADHD. Okay, well, what does ADHD mean for you? Well, I'm distracted in class. I can't pay attention to what the teacher says, so I can't do my homework and I need extra help on the test. Okay. Well, do you feel distracted talking to me right now? Well, no, not at all. Okay, so we could say that you don't have ADHD right now. Well, okay, yeah, I guess. Okay, sure. Okay, so then it wouldn't be fair to say that you have what we're calling ADHD all the time. Well, I guess not. So, we slowly kind of tease apart this narrative because these diagnoses are impactful and, parents hire us to fix the ADHD. We're hired to fix the ADHD, but really the craft is getting underneath that and fixing the undercurrent. And that's true of all these symptoms.
Do you think that ADHD is like overly diagnosed, especially in the United States? I mean, we have like very high stats on that, especially amongst males. What are your thoughts about that? And what do you know about the statistics?
I think frankly, I think some families use it as kind of a blanket, and I think that diagnosis is destructive. I think not to blame families or parents. I don't mean that in any way. I think the whole culture, has shifted so dramatically towards medication and fixing things as opposed to working and talking things through. And I think it's so easy to just label a ADHD diagnosis when in actuality, I see, yes, a very small percentage of the population, so it wouldn't be fair for me, but I've certainly seen a lot of kids resolve their symptoms of ADHD, not through medication, but through learning to dissect the narrative and through learning where their strengths and weaknesses lie. And for some people, they need to reread an article more than once. And that doesn't mean they have ADHD, man. Who told us that we're supposed to comprehend everything we see right away?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I have to read things over and over again sometimes.
And I'm sure his mind never drifted in 10th grade algebra either, right?
Oh, no, not at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, it's almost like we sometimes use these labels or diagnoses or categories as almost a... sometimes it can be used as a cop-out. Sometimes it's accurate. Sometimes it's, convenience and be like, oh, well, don't expect me to change. I mean, I've heard people say this too, like, oh, that's just the way I am. I'm ADHD. Don't expect me to be present for a conversation for 15 minutes with my wife because I'm ADHD. Do you think, as somebody who's licensed, who's gone through the system, do you think that, there is some harm with these diagnostic categories that are sometimes unwisely used, or when they're unwisely used, to be more specific? It can actually cause more harm than healing and benefit.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just because, and this is not, I don't mean blame in any way. I think for some people, at sometimes, obviously, diagnoses can be helpful. However, I would say I see so many teenage boys that have held this diagnosis since they were kids, and they identify with it, and they think that there is something fundamentally wrong with them. And it can often, I think, radically impede their intellectual development because they attach stuff to it. I'm stupid. I'm slow. I don't read well. It saddens me to think that a particular doctor on a particular day with a particular parent might just, write a prescription for ADHD because it's the easiest thing to do, and maybe he genuinely thinks it'll help. But yeah, I do think it can absolutely have long-term devastating impact.
Yeah. And this is, I think, looping back around again to this idea of the narrative and how, the things that we tell ourselves over and over again, or the labels that have been slapped on us and we keep fulfilling or stepping into that meaningful label in the way that we do, can cause us to get stuck, can inhibit our potential. And it almost sounds like it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Would you say that's accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, you also do this work wilderness guide with Stepping Stones project, and this is really interesting and powerful project. So, from my understanding, you do help young men through rites of passage and coming into their own, so to speak. Does this also have to do with this idea of, masculinity or the energetics of masculinity with young men? Can you tell us more about that wilderness guide project?
Sure. Well, that's an organization that arranges groups to start meeting when they're in seventh grade, and they meet periodically once or twice a month until they start ninth grade, and then we also go on several backpacking trips into the backcountry. And this last one I did ended over a year ago, but yeah, we knew these boys for 2 years. They were going into ninth grade, and we went out into Yosemite, high in the mountains, and sent them out on a 1-day solo in nature where they fasted and sat by themselves for 24 hours. And yeah, it's quite edgy. 2 of the boys had a hard time in the night, but they came back, and we held the base camp. And
wow.
And it was amazing to see these kids walk in at dawn. They got sent out at dawn, and they came back at dawn the next day, and they were just so dropped into themselves and such a deeper perspective. Nearly all of them checked in and spoke about wanting to help more, wanting to contribute more to their families, wanting to
wow.
Just be less narcissistic and think less about themselves. I mean, they all, communicated this.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Did they go back home and, were they immediately different? Of course not, but I do believe that this experience is embedded and lives in them, and they'll always have it as a reference point. And we witness them in that. And we witness them in their growth over these 2 years. And that's what it's all about, is helping youth feel seen and accepted and tolerated for who they are, and really drawing out their innate genius, so to speak.
Right. I mean, that's amazing that after 1 day of being out in nature, fasting, you were able to witness such a massive transformation or shift in many of these young men. And as you said, once you go back home, and I hear this a lot from people who go to retreats or whatever. It's I had this awesome injection. I was feeling so full and alive. And then once you get back within a week or two, it's back to the same old routine. But the point here that we're also missing is, well, what if we have more time like that or space like that as a part of our daily lives, whether it's meditation or getting out into nature? These openings that you may have experienced or witnessed on some of these retreats in the wilderness could be perpetually retrieved or accessible. Would you say that's true?
Absolutely. And we also have to remember that psyche functions on its own timeline, and we have to remind our clients of that, and we have to remind ourselves that. And whether we want to quit smoking or lose weight or get control over our kids, it's, these things take time. And what I did want to say too is that, I think back to moments of my first meditation retreat 13 years ago when I was 23 years old, and impactful moments that really stay with me and inform who I am. And I'm able to access that space when I'm with other people too,
Nice. Yeah. It almost leaves a deep imprint or impression that's accessible to one's consciousness. And of course, the more we deepen that imprint or indent, the more accessible it becomes over time too. That's kind of one way to understand this process of transformation.
Absolutely. We start to, get really curious about what that space is and kind of dust it off more and do more work to kind of clean it off and bring out our fire, our light, or whatever we want to call it. Or maybe it's a calm, expansive space,
You also have done some specialization in cannabis dependence, especially with youth. Is that correct?
Well, it's extremely common in the Bay Area. So it's often, a parent will call me and it's often a presenting symptom, not so dissimilar from ADHD. My son smokes weed and my son has ADHD, and one might be a medication of the other. By the way, could be an attempt to sort of, self-medicate, or who knows. But yeah, it's very popular in the Bay Area. I hear that half to 75% of boys, at least according to some of my clients, are, pretty regular smokers, even in high school. To be fair, too, the whole culture and world around cannabis is changing, and we have to keep that in mind, and we have to watch out for putting too much of our, last 100 years and, onto this plant that has been projected upon for millennia. And like ADHD, we have to get curious about it, and we have to look at what function it serves. And the big question in families, if we took out marijuana, would everything else be fine? And inevitably it's not. It's usually just, it's a symbol that can get pointed to. And I'm certainly not advocating, I think the thing that the pretty PC answer these days around the Bay Area is that weed is very harmful to the teenage brain. We all need to be responsible role models and, not smoke and show that to our kids. And we need to teach them to honor their adversity and not numb out their emotions. And, and I think I agree with all of that. And I don't think that's helpful either. I think we have to look at our lives and look at the role it serves, and everyone, it's all case by case too.
So would you say that there are benefits and harm to using cannabis, but it also depends on the context, the person using it, why they're using it? But can you tell us more about what are some of the pros and cons to using cannabis at a young age? Because we also hear quite commonly that an adult brain isn't done kind of forming until about age 21 to 25, sometimes depending on gender. So some people say that, making this argument that, well, if you're using psychoactive drugs like cannabis, you're actually impeding or affecting what would be a natural, more healthy process of your neurology, so to speak. So I wanted to hear your thoughts about that. And then the second question would be, why are so many youth using it from your observations with clients?
Those are great questions. I can't speak to benefits and risks of cannabis. I have adult clients too that come in and, they're like, I smoke cannabis. Is something wrong with me, right? This is like this big question. You research, right? It's not so different from you research coffee, right? There's going to be some studies that are like, it's good for this, it's bad for this, it's good for you, it's bad for you, and who's paying for all this anyway? And it's really hard to know. So I do think we are all, as adults, we're responsible for doing sort of our own phenomenological studies of ourselves in relation to whatever substance we use. And I believe that fully. And I think that therapy is a great place to explore those relationships. And for teenagers, yeah, that's different. Haven't done this research. I don't know. It seems like there's ample research that exactly what you say suggests that for the developing brain, it's better to lay off cannabis. It makes sense. And I would say also we're kind of like infantile in our understanding of cannabis, basically because for the last 100 years, it's been so prohibited. We haven't really studied CBD and THC and all these other things and how they actually impact. And, and it could be that a particular extraction could be helpful for some teenager if, we gave it to them in a pill in the morning. It's not such a big deal, for example, or something like that. I don't know.
Why do you think from your observations and your clientele, what are some of the common reasons why young men do use cannabis? Is it about escapism? Is it about having fun? Is it about pleasure? Is it about bringing out creativity? I mean, what are some of the common themes or reasons why you've observed in your clients?
I got to tell you, it's not generally impressive. I don't have many clients that are like, I smoke and I write poetry and paint, for example, or I smoke and I clean the house, or I smoke and I feel inspired to go to the soup kitchen, for example. Most I think it's generally an FU to the parents or the school, and it's a reaction, I think, to the intense pressure that they feel. And because it's kind of quasi-legal, it's still the cool thing to do, and it's counterculture, and it's pleasurable, and it does lift the feelings of family bullshit and school bullshit, and and I think probably teenagers too, like adults, have an innate desire, at least sometimes, not everyone, some people, to alter their consciousness in various ways. And marijuana is incredibly popular now with people from age, 13 to 80. I mean, it's just becoming popular in the culture. So we all kind of have to adjust. And we are, in our own way, too.
So definitely in the Muslim community, I've definitely observed this has also been an increase presence, right, of parents coming to me and going, Karim, my son smokes weed, or they're using cannabis. And I mean, for the many Muslim parents, marijuana is like the same thing as crack or cocaine to them, right? It's like it's all the same stigmatized, drugs and all these types of things. Obviously, from their perspective, that makes a lot of sense because, they're also looking at it more from a moral perspective too, not just like health-wise or, they're not getting good grades in school, although that's usually branches of it. But it is, I think, even more common, especially with clients in California, because it is so embedded in the culture. It is so commonplace, so to speak, right? Almost as much as the sun. So you do see that even in the Muslim community, but it sounds like even with your clients, their parents are also uncomfortable or concerned about their children's usage of marijuana as well. And so there is a lot of awareness that is, yet to be attained, so to speak. And as you said, there's very little research that has been done fully on this plant, and some people would call it a medicine. But I would also argue that we still don't know a lot about consciousness itself, and we're still making breakthroughs and understanding how the brain works. There's always, of course, a lot to learn, but I wanted to kind of get your perspective as someone who's also, working with the community in the Bay Area, and it sounds like there's still various perspectives and data points around this topic of cannabis dependence and whether or not it's beneficial or harmful.
For sure. I mean, and to me, it's like not the most important thing either. It's like we're always, you work with a family and you're straddling your relationship between the parents and the teenager, right? And that is the important thing to hold, is that thread, because that is what is important, and what needs the reconnect is that thread of relationship. And, I step in and kind of try to re-tie that together. So I, on the one hand, have to align with my client around him smoking cannabis, especially if he has no interest in quitting, and say, oh, wow, cool, you smoke weed. What do you like about it? And then I also have to hold the parent's hand and say, yes, this is concerning, of course, and we're working with this.
Yeah, no, it's very true, because oftentimes, like with some of the youth work I've done, parents kind of have this, drop off our kid mentality and Karim will fix it, But it's like, even if your son quits marijuana, if you two still don't have open channels of communication and healthy bonding and intimacy, part of my understanding of addictions in general is because people are escaping their reality. They don't want to confront their reality, or their reality is painful and uncomfortable. And so, especially for young people, if they don't really feel like they have meaning or purpose, or they're constantly being criticized or feeling unloved, unaccepted by their own parents and family, then of course, you can't just assume that, okay, well, if they quit this quote unquote bad habit, then that's going to solve everything, right? So I'm hearing you say we always have to look at all the variables and all the layers of the dynamics here, and it should never be compartmentalized as just one thing. It's usually interconnected to other things. We're taking away more than we're giving by promoting cannabis usage with youth, especially because most young people don't even know basic things about self-awareness and modifying behaviors and achieving goals as it is. So what happens when we throw alcohol and ecstasy and cannabis into the picture? I mean, it can get very dangerous and scary.
No, and I would never promote cannabis use among youth or anyone. I mean, I think that's an individual decision, and I wouldn't come in and recommend that to anybody. And because it is so incredibly prominent in the culture, I think we have to look at it objectively in some way, and be fishy when it's the main focal point, and it doesn't I just have a message if anyone is listening. It does not work. There is no some kind of like magic formula that I know from graduate school that I could just walk up to a teenager and say to him to make him stop smoking marijuana. That's just not a productive way of looking at it.
Right. Have you found that any of the youth who have done these wilderness retreats, they were users of cannabis, and after the retreat, they felt that that was no longer of use to them?
Yes.
Really?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
How do you think that happens, or why does that happen?
I think that I'll talk about an actual case example with a young man I was working with who was 17 and quite out of control. And yes, he was smoking a large, like a good amount of cannabis. And however, he was also throwing eggs at cars. He was getting in fights. He was drinking. He was driving. He was saying, F you to his parents and getting, is just out of control. And this is not that unusual these days. This happens, kids don't get boundaries in their youth. And I don't know what happens, but his parents decided to send him away to Utah for an 8-week immersion in the wilderness this summer. And he came back and he was completely different. He was dropped in, I would say, multiple, just layers down from where he was. It's like he moved from his head to his core. And and he stopped smoking. He stopped certainly while he was there, and he saw that it wasn't serving him and wasn't good for him and wasn't what he wanted. And will he never smoke weed again? I have no idea. How long will this last for? I don't know. But in any case, I'm very glad that he got this kind of reset. I think that's really important. And I think, and I think as responsible adults that, I think we're all responsible to ourselves, and certainly with a substance like cannabis and coffee and alcohol, we don't want to use these if we don't need them, certainly chronically. And we're all human and we all have attachments and we're all working on ourselves. And we do our best to get by in this world and be healthy as best we can and deal with our emotions and our complex lives, and teenagers are in the same boat. We can't assume that the world of a 16-year-old isn't complex. That's ridiculous.
Yeah, for sure. No, I appreciate that feedback. So, Scott, I'd like to move on to our last segment of the show today. You are also a practitioner of Ashtanga yoga for over 10 years now. Now, first of all, can you define for us what is yoga and what is Ashtanga yoga?
Oh, man, that's a hard thing to define. Well, in my own limited terms, yoga is union, right? And so yoga is this link together between mind and body, between thoughts and movement. So, of course, it relates to somatic psychotherapy, too. It kind of is somatic psychotherapy. And Ashtanga yoga is a particular branch of yoga that was developed by Pattabhi Jois, who was born in Mysore, India in the year 1915. And he studied with Krishnamacharya, who is essentially responsible for bringing yoga to the West. Okay. And so his students were Pattabhi Jois and Iyengar. So, Iyengar is obviously very popular. Pattabhi Jois developed his own yoga called Ashtanga. And then if you see a class that's called Vinyasa Flow or Core Flow or Hot Yoga or anything like this, these are all kind of westernized offshoots of Ashtanga.
Got it. And what does practicing it mean to you, and how do you think it's actually useful to the human being?
It's useful on so many levels, Karim. It's every day, it's a ritual. It's a grounding ritual, right? So every morning, at least 6 days a week, we practice. We come to the mat. We orient our lifestyles around it in some way. We do get up early.
What time do you get up to do your yoga practice every day?
I get about 5.
Wow, you hear that, Muslims? He gets up at Fajr time. That's the time of our dawn prayer. So that's commitment right there.
Well, it's important, for spiritual dedication, and many people get up that early to pray as well, and that's what it is for me. And our sun salutations are not, I think it'd be interesting. I'm sure people have thought about the relationship of sun salutations to prostrations in prayer, So yeah, this is how our practice starts, and then we go into standing postures and seated postures, and all the while, yeah, we're focused on our gaze and our breath, and it's really a focus builder. It's great for health, and it's also just great as a way of psychologically meeting yourself where you're at every morning. And not only that, but we practice in community too, so we're joined by others. And my wife, Ayelet, actually runs a program where she teaches. So she gets up at 3:45 and practices before she teaches. And so she every day teaches, we'll have 10 to 15 people come in of all different levels, all different ages, learning this practice that I believe to be incredibly helpful for me anyway. It's not for everyone, but for me, it's been very, very beneficial.
Now, some people of other faiths might go, oh, I'm not going to do yoga because that's connected to, Hinduism, or it's almost a religious practice. So I'm actually almost betraying my own religion if I practice yoga. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, yoga is not faith-based actually at all, and yoga does not exclude anyone, and yoga in and of itself is not a religion. There is a philosophy associated with yoga, but even that, is broken up into different factions, and there's, the Advaita Vedanta philosophy, there's Hindu philosophy, there's Shakya yoga philosophy, there's Buddhism, there's these different religions that are perhaps connected in some way, and certainly to Indian culture, but yoga in and of itself has never excluded anyone, and certainly continues not to and shouldn't. And not unlike therapy, therapy is open to everyone and requires its own language for each person. Not everyone believes in God, maybe, and not everyone, wants to chant even. That could be edgy for some people, but the philosophy and the postures themselves are not exclusive in any way.
Right. I mean, I started to learn more about yoga myself when I moved to California, and also I wouldn't call myself a practitioner, more of a stretcher, but there's certainly a lot of yoga poses, and one of the things I took away from yoga is it really taught me how to breathe. And what's funny is, like, even when I've gone and gotten like massages, and while I'm breathing during the massage, I've had like my therapist tell me, hey, you must do yoga because the way you're breathing is very common to the yogic practice, and I said, well, I did learn. I think one of the things that yoga did teach me was how to breathe, and that's so important because obviously, I mean, I know in Arabic and in Hebrew, the word for self or soul is also connected to the word for breath. So you have, I think it's nefesh in Hebrew, and it's also nefas in Arabic. So it's very similar, and that means breath as well as it's connected to this word for self. So breath is so important when it comes to integrating oneself, and I think this also builds on this theme of somatic psychology that we were talking about here. The other reflection I had was, and you've seen how Muslims pray, right? The postures that they do. I mean, some of these moves are found in yogic practice,
sure,
as well.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that I find with individuals in the Muslim community, when their prayer they're not feeling very present, or as you described, with many examples today, being stuck in our heads, thinking too much about the I and what I have to do and this and that, and you're not even present. You're just kind of reciting the prayers and doing the motions, and you're not actually taking those deep breaths and pauses and letting your body sink into those positions, which is the way that prayer in Islam is actually prescribed. So it's interesting that there is that commonality with yogic practice and even the daily ritual prayer of the Islamic faith.
Mm-hmm. Well, plenty of people do yoga distracted too. So
sure.
And you make a good point too, and this could relate to our conversation too earlier. It's hard to slow down and be present in our world, and we all know that. And what I wanted to say when you were talking, Karim, is it made me think of music actually. And lately I've been studying classical guitar now for 4 years, really solid. Karim taught me guitar way back in the day. And and I have been slowly learning rhythm and count and timing and all these things that for millennia have been used to get us out of our heads. And Ashtanga, it's brilliant. There is language that does just that. It's a rhythm, and it goes on a particular count, right? There's a particular breath count. It's incredibly deep and intentional. It's not just like, oh, we get up there and we do a headstand when we feel like it, and we take a few deep breaths, and we come down in child's pose, and then we stretch, and then we think about something that we're grateful for, and then the teacher talks about his walk on the ocean. No, this is like the real deal. This is 5 breaths and jumping and bandhas and drishti, and it doesn't really care if sadness comes up or if anger comes up. Like, there isn't really room for it in the actual practice of itself. We can certainly work on our capacity to build with it, to be with it. But the essence is that we continue practicing. We don't stop to say, oh, my body, I don't feel like doing this anymore. My body needs rest. We don't really do that, right? It's discipline.
Yeah. It's pushing your body and your mind to beyond its edges and beyond its comfort zone, which is how you have breakthroughs, essentially.
It does. It requires surrender too. We ask people to practice pretty daily, and we ask them to practice in the tradition, and we try not to be dogmatic about it. Yeah, we aren't dogmatic about demanding that people practice exactly according to tradition, which many Ashtanga studios are accused of being, perhaps rightfully so. We acknowledge different bodies and different minds and different ways of being. And we want students to commit. We want students to show up and practice and be dedicated students. And, I think too often it's so easy to just say, well, I don't really feel, I don't feel like getting up and praying today. I don't feel like doing it. Why should I? And, in order to really kind of move beyond ourselves, I think, just as in learning an instrument, right, we have to dedicate ourselves to the practice of it.
Right. You can never transform if you don't have time and repetition, consistency in that practice. And this idea is also something we hear often, and I hear it in my community, is this idea of, well, I don't feel like praying, because, Muslims, their tradition says praying 5 times a day. And it's like, sometimes people don't feel like praying, right? But is it really, about what we feel, or is it sometimes more about what's best for us? Because there's a lot of things we may not feel like doing, right? Or wanting, but it's actually better for us. Like, I don't always feel like eating healthy, but I know it's so much better for my body, and I'll actually feel better when I do, versus if I just give in to the ego's attachments of eating, a cheesesteak sub.
Of course, right? Of course.
Which I love, by the way. I'm a huge fan. So
you are allowed to have that every once in a while, but and our thoughts and feelings are transitory too. We have to remember that.
Right. It's they come and go, and again, I think a key point is.
Sorry. It's just, how else are we going to get this without the daily practice? It's like, we have to have discipline to see this. So I'm obviously a huge advocate of this kind of more, 5-6 times a week, we pray or whatever we do as our grounding foundation, and that's our rhythm, and that's our life. And then, what our ego wants and says and demands on top of that is kind of extra. And of course there are demands. We have to take our children to school and this and that. And yet, gosh, I'm just such a strong proponent of finding a space to really develop one's practice, whatever it may be. I think it's so essential.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, I bear witness to just seeing your transformation, since the day I met you and your body is just in much better shape. You've lost a lot of weight. You're much stronger. And I witnessed all of that just over the years. I'm like, man, Scotty, you really took this, upon yourself, this practice of yoga. And I saw the dedication and the transformation. It's a beautiful thing to witness. So you're almost living proof for what you're claiming here. And I think that's really good, valuable advice. Scotty Pro, are there any last tips or suggestions that you'd like to leave the audience with in helping us improve in our well-being or this connection of mind and body, which you specialize in?
Yeah, I just want to encourage everyone who wants any kind of support to really reach out and, call Karim or call a therapist in your area and start working with someone you resonate with, and this is important. We all need to have mentors. We all need to have coaches. Everybody needs guidance. Let's end the stigma around reaching out for support. And, life is hard. Families are hard. It's hard growing up. It's hard being an adult. It's hard finding our way in this culture that every day has, more and more suffering. And yeah, whether you reach out to a therapist or a group or friends, I just strongly advocate the power of community. So please reach out and ask for what you need.
Love it. Love it. Scott, thank you so much for being on the show today. God bless you and your family and your work. And as always, it's an honor to see you. And hopefully we'll have you on again sometime soon.
All right. Thank you.
Karim Sirajuddin here. Thank you for tuning in. Please visit nurhuman.com to learn more about how I provide personal, spiritual, and relationship counsel and growth. Please generously help sponsor the show to keep on going at patreon.com/coffeewithkareem. That's patreon.com/coffeewithkareem.